I hope you're sitting down for this installation of the TrackTac rear suspension kit. This is a long video, so bear with us. We'll be going through a lot of details, key components, and a whole lot of reasons why you need this kit. So the first thing we're going to be covering is the rear subframe. Now this subframe has a lot of key components and adjustability. So the first thing you'll notice is this is the updated design with the taller 370Z front ears and the holes being slotted left to right, as well as the axle clearance for the boots of the 370Z differential. You'll also notice that we have the bushings in the front, and we added this additional brace for removing any sort of little vibrations and stiffening up the subframe. Now the brace is removable, so you can access the 370Z differential in and out, and you can also still install the differential by just removing the rear apex bar. Now this has the bushings in the front, as well as this removable bar that holds the front of the subframe square for installation use. The next thing that we're going to be going through is going to be the rear upper control arm. The rear upper control arms, you can see, have a uniball design compared to the original. They still maintain the on-car adjustment by simply turning this adjuster left and right. You can extend and shorten, essentially improving or increasing and decreasing your camber. The uniball has a snap ring installation, and besides that, that is really all the changes that have occurred with that guy. The next thing that we are going to be covering is the rear lower control arm. Now the rear lower control arm, we also added the uniball as well as kept the toe link, however completely redesigned this and made it absolutely unique for just the TrackTac kit. Now here you'll notice that we have the fixed rod ends on the end and the uniball with the snap ring on the top. We still have the two holes for the sway bar. We do offer a little bit of adjustability as far as your track width goes, so you are able to use either hole depending on what your track width is set to. Next is the rear strut brace. Now this has also been completely redesigned as a straight bar across, improves the motion ratio, as well as gives you a lot more ample adjustment on your coilover. And next is going to be the rear uprights. Now the rear uprights have also been completely redesigned. Boy, we have really not kept a whole lot of the original TrackTac. You'll still notice it has the new 4-lug and 5-lug bolt pattern, as well as the dual 370Z and our Wilwood brake kit bolt options. Now it still has the 370Z e-brake option on the bottom, and now the uniballs would sit in the middle, as well as adding the push rod mounting to the upright. You got the 370Z parking brake setup on the bottom, and these things are quite heavy. And the next thing up on our list are the billet aluminum rockers. These are really pretty, really shiny, and they do come with the bearings already pressed in from us. And the next thing up on our list is the push rods. These are adjustable, and they will have a right hand and left hand bung, so you can adjust your ride height. You'll have a large rod end on one side and a smaller rod end that goes into the rocker on the other side. You can take a look at the differences right there. We'll cover that more in the installation videos. The nice thing about it is being right hand, left hand, you can just turn the bar and that will raise and lower your car. Ooh, look at that pinky work. And then we got the axles. Now these axles are machined from a 4340 chunk of steel and then heat treated. They're quite beefy, and they are splined on each end to accept the 370Z axle CVs. And you'll also have a bushing box that you'll receive from us. Now we don't assemble the mustache bar bushings, but it's easy for you to do. We'll go through this bushing box. Got a little bit of grease, we got some washers, we have the bushings, and we have the sleeves. And Prothane will also be really generous and provide some instructions for us. But we'll go ahead and cover that on the install of this video as well. And finally, you'll also have a pair of these plates. Now these are just reinforcement plates for the push rods, and that's just because we're transferring the load of this strut tower, so we want to make sure we keep that rigid. And finally, what most people love about the kit, the coilovers. These are dual adjustable Viking series coilovers. Alright, now you have a ton of hardware in front of you. Let's go through each section of this. You'll have sections that will dictate of what each part is. You'll notice you have ones for rear control arm, rocker, strut brace, upper control arms, various different parts of the kit. This way it makes it organized for you to know which exact bolts go where and can follow along with the instructions a little bit easier. So let's go ahead. We're going to start with the left side. These are going to be the rear lower control arms. In the rear lower control arms, you're going to have a pair of these 5/8 rod end. You will have 8 of these misalignment spacers. You will also have 2 of these 5/8 jam nuts, followed by 2 of these 5/8 nylon lock nuts. And with that, you'll have 8 of the 5/8 washers and 24 of the 1/2" washers. After that, you'll have 4 of these 1/2" nylon lock nuts, followed by 4 of these 1/2" bolts. And after that, we'll have 2 of these 5/8 hex adjusters. Then you'll have 4 of these conical spacers, followed by 4 of these cylindrical spacers. And finally, you will have a pair of these 5/8 bolts. Next, we're going to start the middle sheet. The top one is going to be the rockers. We're going to have 4 of these 1/2" socket head bolts, followed by 8 of these 1/2" washers. And after that, finally, we have 4 of these 1/2" nylon lock nuts. Next, we're going to go with the upper control arm. The upper control arm is going to consist of 8 of these 5/8 washers, followed by 4 of the 1/2" washers, followed by a pair of the 5/8 nylon lock nuts, and a pair of the 1/2" nylon lock nuts. It's going to be followed with 2 of the 5/8 bolts and 2 of these 1/2" long bolts. Next, you're going to have a pair of these 1/2" long spacers, followed by 8 of these 5/8 to 1/2" misalignment spacers. Next, you're going to have 4 of these conical spacers and 4 of these cylindrical spacers. And finally, on the top here, we're going to be going through the uprights. So on the uprights, we're going to have 8 of these M12 socket head bolts, followed by 2 of these 5/8 bolts. Underneath that, we got 8 of these M12 lock washers, followed by 4 of these 5/8 washers, followed by 2 of these conical spacers. And finally, we got the rear strut brace. That's going to have 4 of these 1/2" bolts, 16 of these 1/2" washers, followed by 4 of these 1/2" lock nuts. Then you'll have 4 of these socket head bolts, followed by 4 of these 3/8 washers, and followed by 4 of these 3/8 nylon lock nuts. And you will also have 4 of these spacers for the rear strut brace. And first thing we're going to do is we're going to install the rear lower control arms. To install these is pretty simple. We have these rod ends that we're going to have pre-assembled, and we're going to go ahead and attach the 5/8 hex adjusters to them. Now you'll notice it has a groove cut into them to symbolize a left-hand thread, and the other side that doesn't have a groove is going to be a right-hand thread. So we're going to grab the hex spacers, the 5/8 jam nuts, and the 5/8 rod ends. First thing we're going to do is we're going to install the jam nuts onto the rod ends. And then we're going to make sure we put anti-seize in there, but for the sake of this video, we will not. Then we're going to go ahead and attach the hex adjuster to the rod end. And always, again, make sure you put anti-seize on all your thread components, but we're going to go ahead and thread this onto there. We're going to go ahead and do the same thing to the other side. So once you have both of those guys done, we're going to go ahead and assemble the 5/8 spacers into each one of these rod ends. Then after that, we're going to grab the 1/2" washers, and we're going to grab 4 of them. We're going to put 2 on each side, followed by a bolt and the 1/2" nylon lock nut. So we're going to go ahead and put 2 on that side, followed by 2 more washers onto the other side, and the nylon lock nut to kind of hold it in place. Now we're just kind of hand tightening that, so once we bring it to the car, it makes it easier to install. We're going to do that to all 4 sides, and then after that, we're going to have a few leftover washers, and those will be just in case if we need to make up any spacing gaps. Next, we're going to grab the 5/8 bolts, toss a 5/8 washer through that, slip that through the rod end, and then we're gonna grab the conical spacer and the cylindrical spacer. Now notice the orientation that we have this in. The cylindrical spacer is gonna go towards the uniball bearing, and then we're gonna have the other side as the cylindrical spacer and then the conical spacer as well. Now you might need a finesse with the adjuster because you will have the upright in between there. Then again, we're gonna do the same thing on the other side, conical spacer, outside, cylindrical spacer towards the uniball. Following that with a 5/8 washer and a 5/8 nut. And then go ahead and do that same thing to the other side. And you'll notice here we have articulation, which is perfect, and that's the way the both sides should articulate. And then having a small amount of extra leftover washers is completely fine. You may need them for later. So then after that, we're gonna go ahead and install the rear upper control arm. The rear upper control arm assembly is pretty easy. First thing we're gonna do is we're gonna grab the 5/8 bolt and a 5/8 washer, and then a conical spacer and a cylindrical spacer. Remember, just like the rear lower control arm, the cylindrical spacer goes towards the uniball. Then we're gonna follow that with another cylindrical spacer on the other side, and then a conical spacer. Now you see the articulation there, and then we're gonna go ahead and follow that with a 5/8 washer and a 5/8 nylon lock nut. And we're gonna go ahead and do the same thing to the other side. Next, we're gonna go ahead and install the 5/8 spacers into each of the rod ends. Now, these are misalignment spacers that do transfer the bore from my 5/8 to a 1/2 inch on the inside, and do that to all 4 of the rod ends. Next, we're gonna grab the 1/2 inch long bolt. We're gonna slide a 1/2 inch washer onto it. Then we're also gonna go ahead and slide the 1/2 inch spacer between the misalignment spacers, followed by another 1/2 inch washer and the 1/2 inch nylon lock nut. And we're gonna go ahead and do the same thing to the other side. And you'll notice you'll have about 4 of the 5/8 washers, a little bit extra here. Go ahead and keep those because you may need those when going to install the upright. So next we're gonna go ahead and install the rockers. First thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna attempt to slide the rocker hardware. So first thing you're gonna do is you're gonna take the 1/2 inch washer onto the socket head bolt, follow that by a 1/2 inch washer on the other side, and the nylon lock nut. You're gonna do that to all 4 of those holes. And now we have the rear uprights. Now we're gonna go ahead and pre-install these. Now this kit does not come with the wheel bearings, however, the customer has provided us wheel bearings, and we're gonna go ahead and show you how we install that. Prior to installing the wheel bearings, we're gonna go ahead and put the 5/8 washer onto this 5/8 bolt, followed by a conical spacer on the other side. Now notice the orientation of the conical spacer, and we're gonna round that out with a 5/8 nylon lock nut. So now the customer has provided us with the 370Z wheel bearings. We're gonna go ahead and install the wheel bearings onto the rear uprights. You'll notice that these wheel bearings are 5-lug. We do offer a 4-lug pattern, and the 4-lug pattern would, instead of using these 4 holes, would use these 4 holes. We're essentially be drilling them for an S30 or 240SX 4-lug wheel bearing. So first of all, we're gonna go ahead and line up the holes onto the upright. Once you have the holes lined up, we're gonna go ahead and take your M12 split lock washer and put that onto the socket head bolt and start tightening those guys down. So once you have all 4 of those per each side done, you have pretty much assembled the rear uprights. And now we're gonna be pre-installing the rear strut brace. The rear strut brace, we're gonna install the rockers first, and then we're gonna install the coilovers. But first we're gonna go ahead and cut these zip ties off. Once those are out of there, we're gonna go ahead and slide the rockers through the strut brace. The first thing you're gonna do is gonna take a 1/2 inch washer onto the 1/2 inch bolt, and then slide that through the furthest from the center hole. That is what most guys will use, unless you're running aftermarket coilovers, such as, unless you're running different brand coilovers, we do offer holes for other brands. So then once those bolts are through the hole, we're gonna go ahead and flip the strut brace. We're gonna put another 1/2 inch washer, followed by the 1/2 inch nylon lock nut. Next, we're gonna go ahead and install the coilovers to the strut brace. First thing we're gonna do is we're gonna grab another 1/2 inch washer, put it onto the 1/2 inch bolt, and put that through the coilover hole. Now you'll notice the width of the coilover is a little bit narrower than the supplied strut brace. This is because customers, if they wanted to go with the Oilin's coilovers or other brands besides our Vikings that are provided, they have the option and ability to do so. But in order to make the gap between the Vikings and our strut brace, we're gonna put 2 washers on this one side. We're gonna slip the coilover through that and attach the bolt. Then we're gonna put 2 washers on the other side. Once that's all installed, we're gonna go ahead and put the coilover onto the rocker. We're gonna do the same thing to the other side. So So now we kind of have the piece of resistance. We have the full rear track attack, coilover, and strut brace installed. Go ahead and flip it and install the 1/2" washers and the 1/2" nylon lock nuts. And now we're going to go ahead and install the supplied bushings onto the rear subframe. Now you'll notice you'll have 4 bushings, some grease, some washers, and the spacers that go inside the bushings. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and pop the bushings onto the subframe, but without doing it with the grease is a lot harder. Next, you're going to go ahead and put the sleeves through the subframe, and then remember you're going to be running the large diameter washer on the top of the subframe and the small diameter on the bottom of the subframe. So once you got those bushings in, we can go ahead and install the upper control arm and the lower control arm. So we're going to start with the lower control arm. We're going to go ahead and line up those holes as you can see here shown. We're going to loosen the 1/2" nylon nut. We're going to align it, and then we're going to go ahead and remove the bolt, slide the rear lower control arm on, and then slide the bolt back through. Now you'll notice we have the stack of washers in case for any misalignments, and those are also due to which hole you select on the control arm. So in this case, we're just going to select the top hole on the rear. We're going to slide 2 washers between the spacers and the tabs on the rear control arm, and then once those are set, you can go ahead and hand tight the nylon lock nut. Now you'll notice that we have this bolt going in this direction rather than going in from the back, and that's so then the clamp is able to be removed without having to drop the whole subframe. Here we also will put 2 washers between the spacers and the control arm tabs, followed by the nylon lock nut to hand tight everything back up. Next, we're going to do the rear upper control arm. We're going to go ahead and loosen up that nylon lock nut. We're going to pull that bolt through, and we're going to align the control arm to the tabs on the rear upper control arm, to the tabs on the subframe. First thing we're going to do is we're going to take the 1/2" bolt, have it held in there. We're going to slide the rear upper control arm through those brackets. We're going to use a spacer that goes in the middle here, and going to go ahead and pull that through. And then we're going to follow it up with a 1/2" washer on the other side and a 1/2" nylon lock nut. Now, one thing to note is you do have to install the rear upper control arm prior to installing it on the car. You can install the rear lower control arm after. Now, unfortunately, we did lose a little bit of footage on mounting the upper control arm and lower control arm to the upright, but here you can note the orientation. We will cover it later in the video, but you can notice that the upper control arm is just bolted right to the upright on the top mount and the lower control arm on the bottom mount. And here you'll notice at the toe link and how you're able to easily adjust toe onto the car. The other thing to notice is how you'll be able to adjust your camber on the car. By simply loosening the jam nuts, you're able to increase and decrease your camber by turning those adjusters counterclockwise or clockwise. And here we're going to install the 240Z differential onto the rear subframe. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and remove that front bar, or at least move it out of the way. That's going to make installation onto the subframe a little easier. Now you can also remove the apex bar on the back and lift it up through that, but we found that it was easier because it's just one person and a car jack here to put that onto the subframe this way. Now the other thing to know is we do not provide these bolts that mount the differential to the subframe. However, we did find that 1/2" bolts work, and we're just going to use them for the video purposes. Next, we're going to go ahead and pull the subframe brace back down. We can go ahead and tighten those using the socket head bolts on the ends there. And now we're pretty much ready to go ahead and lift this on the car. Now you'll notice that the subframe is already on the car. It was really difficult to get with it just with me and Joey, especially with all the control arms installed. So we went ahead and just kind of pre-installed it on the car. We still have to mount it on the front, and we also did disconnect the upright and the rear upper control arm. You guys can get a better visual on how it's installed. So you can see here that we have the mustache bar installed. We reused the factory bolts. And the same thing, you're going to reuse the factory bolts on the front of the car as well. You're going to take the clamp that we provide with the kit. Then you're going to take the factory supplied bolts. So you can see here we temporarily fitted the front of the subframe onto the car. We still have to torque it down. We also did remove the front bar. Now you'll notice that this bar does have it etched that to remove after installation. And that's just to help keep the front bars the same distance during installation. They do warp a little bit during welding, so we do keep that bar in there to help you. So a few things to consider when purchasing the rear track attack kit is going to be the year of the car. Now this is a 240Z. You can notice that we have clearance and ample room on a lot of the suspension bits. We do know if you have a 280Z, you will have an issue with the fuel pump bracket hitting the 370Z ears on the front of the diff. Now, if you're running a fuel cell or you're planning to run an aftermarket fuel setup, you really won't need the fuel pump bracket, but if you're planning to run like an OEM fuel pump, then you will need that bracket there. Now, we went ahead and pre-installed the 370Z axles already. You can go ahead and check out our other video of the 370Z axle install right there. But for this sake, we already did pre-install it. If you wanted more information, you can go ahead and check out that video. So notice here we have the pair of axles. You'll have the bolts that come supplied with the original axles, hopefully, as well as the nuts that came with the axle. So we're gonna go ahead and install the passenger side axle. Now, one thing to note, if you are living in the United States of America, the passenger side is going to be the longer axle. So we're gonna go ahead and put the 6-bolt flange onto the flange of the differential. Once you have the flange installed, you can go ahead and slide that through the upright, and then using the nut on the axle, you can go ahead and tighten that down by hand. The next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna install the rear upper control arm to the upright. We're gonna remove the nylon lock nut onto the rear upright and go ahead and push the bolt through the rear upright. Then you're gonna run the 5/8 washer and the 5/8 nylon lock nut back on again. So now we have one side axle completely installed. We're gonna go ahead and do that to the other side. Now, one thing to also note is the clearance on here. Now, depending on the ride height and how low you go, you may need to notch and cut or modify this pinch weld area. The other area to note that you might have interference is gonna be this area right here on the frame rail. Now, again, it really does depend on the ride height, and if you are going low, you may have to notch or fill that area or add some clearance. Now, this customer is not going that low, so he does not need to do any of that. And so for this video, we're not going to be doing any modifications to those areas. So next, you're gonna go ahead and set your rear strut brace assembly onto the strut towers of the car. So notice here we have it completely loose, and we're gonna go through some areas that you will need to modify for this install. The first area is going to be the top of the strut tower. Now, you notice here that what we did is just traced around the line on the strut tower brace that we provide. This is to give you ample clearance for your push rod to articulate under its suspension travel. So we're going to go ahead and trim this using this die grinder bit. This does make really quick work and really clean work to make this hole opened up. You go ahead and see we already removed the top lip, but we're going to go ahead and use the die grinder and open that up. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to install these shims. After you drill out the holes for the lower of the strut brace, we're going to go ahead and put these shims in between the strut tower and the chassis itself. Now, you'll notice that we provide 4 shims with the kit. More often than not, you do not need to use all 4 shims. Next, you're going to run your 3/8 washer and your 3/8 nut on both the top and the bottom of the strut tower. So we are only going to leave those hand tight for now, so then we can get the tops of the strut towers bolted in as well. So first, we're going to go ahead and take the 3/8 washer, put it onto the socket bolt, and put it through. Next, you're going to take the sandwich plate or the reinforcement plate, and you're going to put that from underneath the strut tower. Your factory sheet metal on the strut tower is going to sandwich between the reinforcement plate and the strut brace. So once you have all 6 of those, 3 on each side, bolted through, you can go ahead and install the push rod. So you'll notice the push rod, we're going to have the smaller 1/2-inch diameter hole rather than the 5/8 that's going to attach to the knuckle. The 1/2-inch hole is going to attach to the rocker. So here's a quick glance on how we installed the push rod to the rocker. Next, we're going to go ahead and install the push rod to the knuckle. We're going to loosen up the 5/8 nylon lock nut. Then we're going to raise the upright to mount the push rod, and then we're going to retighten the 5/8 nylon lock nut. So that wraps up about the install. Now we're going to go through some pre-components here. Here we got the axle installed. You can notice that we have ample clearance for the axle. When it rotates, you'll notice that the axle has a ton of clearance between the axle and then the subframe itself due to the redesign. You'll also notice a push rod gives you a lot more room to run a wider tire. The push rod actually seats behind the wheel well. Now we're going to go through some torque settings to go through all the nuts and bolts. So the first thing you'll do is you're going to torque the mustache bar bolts as well as the front bolts that mount the subframe to the chassis to the factory manual torque settings. So now we're going to go through torque specs. All the nylon lock nuts that are on the kit, those are going to be torqued to 60 foot-pounds. The rear 2 Allen bolts that are on the rear brace, those are going to be torqued to 65 foot-pounds. The wheel bearing bolts that hold the hub pattern, those socket head bolts, those are going to be torqued to 56 to 69 foot-pounds. And the axle nut is going to be torqued to 152 to 202 foot-pounds, but we do recommend referring to the Nissan OEM manual for that. Now stick around for just a little bit longer. We are following up with a things to consider portion of the video. This will help determine if this suspension kit is right for your build. So a couple things to consider is going to be when installing the rear track attack kit, you're going to notice that the wheel and the track width is going to be the same as factory. However, they are adjustable control arms. You do have the adjustments up here and you have the adjustments on the back over here. The other thing to consider is going to be on the 280Z, you're going to have a fuel pump that goes right here, the bracket for the fuel pump, and that will be in the way of the 370Z differential and will have to be modified or relocated. The other thing to note is going to be the notch on the frame, which you did see in the video before, and as well as the spare tire clearance for the back of the bar. Now the reason we did this is because although tubing is a really lightweight and robust use of designing suspension, it also has its limitations due to its size. And so in incorporating that, we had to have the 370Z diff up there out of the way. The other thing to note is going to be the other chassis modification is going to be over here. You're going to notice that you have a lot more clearance of your wheel. You could pretty much run up to your wheel well, where the push rod will not be in the way. The push rod's actually sunken in further, so you can fit a larger wheel. You'll notice here that we also have ample axle clearance between the boots and as its suspension goes into motion. Now, as we talked about before, is we have the clearance here and the clearance here may be required depending on how low you go. Now, generally people won't go that low, so in this customer's case, we do not have to clearance those. And now we got the B-roll, and that's all we got for this long video. Thanks for sticking around. Don't forget to like and subscribe.